Hello and welcome to Korean Politics Debrief with me, Kwon Jang-ho. The presidential race is progressing quickly. The primaries are in fact already coming to a head. The Democratic Party are set to announce their nominee this Sunday, and the People Power Party race is wrapping up a few days after that as well. For the Democratic Party, it's becoming a prolonged anointment of Lee Jae-myung. There are two other candidates in the running, Kim Kyung-soo, the former South Gyeongsang Province governor, and Kim Dong-yeon, the current Gyeonggi Province governor. But some of the regional results are already out, and Lee has won a staggering 90% of the vote. That is unprecedented, and it seems for the DP, it's all about now finishing the primaries with as little fuss as possible, avoiding any sort of negative scandal. And importantly, the other candidates are playing ball as well on that front. So there's no repeat of 2022, where primary rival Lee Na-yeon raised a lot of the real estate corruption allegations against Lee, which some say cost Lee Jae-myung the presidency. It's all quiet and smooth sailing for the DP this time. Now, it's the PPP, I should say the Conservative bloc as a whole, that is far more interesting. Now, on the surface, it would seem that the winner of the PPP primary is set to go up against Lee Jae-myung for the election, but there is much more going on at the moment. If we look at the PPP primary first, there were 11 candidates who registered, but that was whittled down to 8 almost immediately, and now that is down to 4. Now, first there's Kim Moon-soo, the former Labour minister, who's seen as the most right-wing candidate. He supported Yoon the most throughout the impeachment saga, and therefore he has the strongest support from the pro-Yoon supporters. But that appears to be wavering a little now. On the other extreme, there's the former PPP chief Han Dong-un. Now, he is, of course, the figure who led the drive for his party to impeach Yoon following the martial law crisis. He is considered the most moderate, but he's also labelled as a betrayer by the pro-Yoon supporters. But when push comes to shove, I'm sure they'd still rather have him as president rather than Lee Jae-myung, of course. Next is Hong Jun-pyo, the former Daegu mayor. Now, he is considered somewhere in the middle between Kim and Han, leaning more to the right, though. In the past, he had some significant support from young men in their 20s and 30s who found his old-fashioned frankness refreshing. That was on top of the more traditional conservative voters, of course. But we'll see if he still has that sort of support now. And the somewhat surprising fourth candidate is An Chol-soo. Now, he is the founder of the major software firm and therefore the richest lawmaker in Korea. But he's also considered a centre-right moderate. He is unfortunately also best known as a perennial loser or quitter politically. That comes after he lost or pulled out of some major posts that he ran for, like president and Seoul mayor in the past, and he is likely to lose out again this time. There was also lawmaker Na Kyung-won, who many pundits expected to be the fourth candidate ahead of An Chol-soo. She made some noise for her vocal support of Yoon Suk-yeol and some controversial ads, but I suspect that is what cost her in the end as well. Okay, so the race is really between Kim Moon-soo, Han Dong-un, and Hong Jun-pyo, the first three that I mentioned for the PPP primary. The results of the next round will be announced on April 29th, and if no one has an outright majority, and that appears unlikely at this point, there will be a final head-to-head runoff, the winners of which will be announced on May 3rd. But that might not be the end of it. There are currently reportedly forces at play that are trying to make the acting president and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo the Conservative candidate. Now, registration for the PPP primary is over, and Han Duck-soo isn't even officially a member of the PPP. But there are people behind the scenes, reportedly, people close to Yoon, that have chosen him as their candidate. So the alleged plan is that once the PPP primary was over, or nearly over, Han Duck-soo will declare his bid as an independent. And then eventually, the PPP candidate will drop out to support Han as the unified conservative candidate for the good of the nation. And if you listen to the Korean media at the moment, there is all this talk of the big tent. And this one big tent aims to bring together everyone who is against Lee Jae-myung becoming president. This would ideally include not only Han Duck-soo and the PPP, but also other anti-Lee Jae-myung groups as well, such as the former PPP lawmaker and centre-right darling Yoo Seung-min, Lee Jun-suk of the Reform Party, and even people affiliated with the left side of politics, people affiliated with the DP, like Lee Na-gyun. The platform would essentially be anyone but Lee Jae-myung. And this all seemed rather far-fetched at first, but it has unexpectedly been building steam in recent days. And in fact, it's suspected that this is the reason why another leading PPP candidate, Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hun, dropped out earlier. To his chagrin, he realized that these senior figures in the party pulling the strings were backing Han Duck-soo rather than him. And knowing that, he dropped out. That's the speculation anyway. Now, clearly there are so many ways that this could go wrong. This first requires the PPP nominee to drop out at some point, but the only candidate that would perhaps do so willingly or quietly is Kim Mun-soo. So there is already talk that the nefarious behind-the-scene forces are doing everything in their power for him to win the primary. But if Hong Jun-pyo or Han Dong-un win, it seems unlikely they would drop out for Han Duck-soo. And then there's also the idea of the big tent to include everyone anti-Lee Jae-myung. That is likely going to be a bit of a stretch. All of the figures I mentioned are too ideologically disparate, especially because Han Duck-soo would be seen as someone who's being backed by the impeached and disgraced President Yoon Suk-yeol, or at least figures close to him. And that is a major sticking point. He's being touted because he has a reputation for being a calm and experienced economic technocrat, a safe pair of hands, the adult in the room when dealing with Donald Trump, for example, especially because he speaks English as well. But his ties to Yoon are going to be hard to shake off. Now, Han hasn't actually declared whether he will run or not, but he's kept it mysteriously ambiguous. He even replied no comment when he was asked about it in a recent interview with the Financial Times, so that's neither a denial nor a confirmation. But it seems he's being offered this chance on a platter, so some would say, why not run at this point? There's not much for him to lose personally, to at least give it a go. It doesn't seem he's looking to continue his political career after this either, and everyone around him is doing the hard work for him. Now, while all of these conspiratorial machinations among the Conservative bloc have been quite compelling to watch, ultimately, the big elephant in the room is the fact that at the moment, despite all the effort that these senior figures are exerting to control who ends up as their candidate, Lee Jae-myung is still the outright favourite to win the election. The latest polls show that his support is now in the 50% range, while the closest rivals are only in the 20% range. So all of this manipulation is likely for naught. That's when it comes to the presidential election. Rather, it appears to be more about control over the party. We'll see if Han Duck-soo does really run in the end. I have my doubts. Ultimately, for many, this election is simply about a referendum on the martial law crisis and former President Yoon, and no amount of backroom shenanigans will likely change that. Okay, with all that in mind, then, let's take a step back for our interview today. Now, this week I spoke to a figure who first came to South Korea in 1982, and he became a reporter here covering the Korean Peninsula. He was the correspondent in Korea for The Guardian, The Washington Times. He became the first non Korean president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club in 1987 as well. He even became an honorary citizen of Seoul in 2001. He eventually got into consulting and PR, setting up his own firm here in Seoul, but he continued to write about Korea. He's written several books over the years, one about Kim Jong-il in 2004, one called The Koreans in 2004 as well, and then an update essentially of that book called The New Koreans, The Story of a Nation, that was in 2017. That was on the cusp of President Park Geun-hye's impeachment, of course. His name is Michael Breen, and I wanted to talk to him today to talk about his story, but also to try and look back at the recent martial law crisis from a more broader perspective. We go down quite a winding path today where he shares with us some interesting stories and anecdotes from his early days as a reporter, as well as his analysis of what's changed about Korea and the current state of Korean politics as well. So let's get into that now. The interview was recorded on Friday, the 18th of April. Okay, so I have with me now Michael Breen, the veteran journalist covering Korea. It's an honor to have you on the pod today.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Okay, so can you introduce yourself in your own words for us? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm British, and my background's in journalism. I came to Korea. I spent all my adult life, pretty much so. I mean, most of it in Korea.
You came to Korea in 1982.
82,
right?
yeah.
And how old were you then?
30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'd worked for a few years before. I mean, as a labourer, I'd worked on North Sea oil rigs and stuff like that. So I had a bit of a checkered history, and I came out here as a freelance journalist with no experience in journalism. In other words, a wannabe journalist. The thing is that there were very few expats here, freelancers. And so, if you were keen enough, and being a foreign correspondent is a kind of job that a lot of people, even in journalism, can't do because you're totally on your own. You're self-motivating, and you've got no editor, no people telling you what to do. You haven't got colleagues, and so on. And if you do get a bit depressed or lazy, you're the only one who can perk yourself up again.
Right, it's quite a lonely existence.
So it's not for everybody. But the advantage was that Korea was peripheral to news. So basically the wisdom in those days, and this was the days of physical newspapers, the wisdom was that an American or British paper could only handle 2 Asian stories on its foreign news pages. Foreign news doesn't sell.
Right.
So you can't go too much into it. So if you've got China doing something and Japan doing something, the chances of getting your story about Korea in the papers is limited. Korea was quite newsworthy during the 1980s from that point of view. We were able to get into the papers. And that dropped off after the Olympics in '88 and democratization. It dropped off the news. And the shift went to North Korea, actually.
Right, so in the 80s, it was about what's happening in Korea. It wasn't inter-Korean news.
No.
It was about the authoritarian rule and protests,
exactly.
student protests, things like that.
Exactly, and preparation for the Olympics, and then the economic development. Those were the 3 big themes. And North Korea was very peripheral.
Interesting, okay.
Occasionally something would happen. There was a false story once in 1984 that Kim Il-sung had died. The CIA picking up North Korean broadcasts misinterpreted what was being said. And there was a story for a day or two that he died. And then there was a sort of follow-up to that where some people wrote, well, perhaps his double died. This type of thing. So, but that was a very brief.
Sure.
So North Korea, occasionally a story come up as more of the quirky kind of story. But in the 1990s, when North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and started developing its nuclear program, then, and at that point, or in time, the issue of North Korea went from being a Pentagon thing, it went to the desk of the American president, then it became news. So because there were so few expats, I mean, most of the foreign press were actually Koreans, English-speaking Koreans.
Right, okay.
So I was able to get good strings, whereas I don't think I could have got hired by a major newspaper in Britain and then sent out as a correspondent. The competition was too high. So those people tended to be in Hong Kong or Tokyo, and then later Beijing.
Okay, so what brought you to Korea?
Well, it's a long personal story, but my plan was to go to Hong Kong. And I'd married my British wife, had worked here. She's a ballet teacher, and said, well, why don't we go to Korea? Because she was the one who could get a job.
Right, okay.
And then move on in time. That was sort of the vague plan. And in the end, she moved on and I stayed.
So it was quite personal reasons you came to Korea,
It was
rather than you
personal.
were looking for some sort of career, or you were looking to kind of get to know Asia or anything like that. It wasn't that kind of thing.
No,
Okay.
I mean, I'm not a good planner. I can tell other people what to do, but I'm not a good planner for myself. And I realized looking back that some of the things I've done in my life were by happenstance or spontaneous.
Okay.
I mean, I spent 3.5 years in the North Sea on an oil rig, and I look back and think, well, how did that happen? It's just someone said, "Hey, have you heard they're hiring on the rigs and they're paying well?" So coming to Korea was not part of a plan, and I knew almost nothing about the place.
So then how did you fall into reporting about Korea, wanting to cover news about Korea?
Well, I got a couple of what we call strings. As a stringer, freelancer, you get a couple of strings. And either you succeed or you don't. At first I found it quite difficult. I remember one time because I was a foreigner and then starting to work as a journalist. In those days, the opposition party in particular were very interested in us. And because
they were out of power, they needed, I guess, international support.
Yeah, they needed all that, and the local press was, I wouldn't say controlled. The local press was self-censoring.
Okay.
This is a time of dictatorship.
Sure.
So we became very significant. So the handful of expats were left alone. So we became important. I remember, to give you an example of my ignorance, I remember one time being told by somebody, "Oh, do you want to come and meet Mr. Kim?" So I thought, "Oh, okay. Who's Mr. Kim?" "Oh, he's just finished a 21-day hunger strike or something." So I go up to the top floor of the Koreana Hotel. The elevator opens, and there seems to be like 100 people milling around. And as I step into the area, because I'm this foreigner, the waters part, and I'm presented with this man with grey hair, and have no idea what to ask him or what to say, but feels sort of almost like thrust on a stage.
Okay.
Anyway, this was Kim Yong-sam.
Right, I was going to say.
Opposition leader and future president of the country, who had come off a 21-day protest fast. and this is also part of my stupidity, that I'm not a great preparer. I learn things by doing them. I don't learn them by... If you had said to me, look, you've got to read up about this guy before you go and see him, my eyes would start to glaze over very quickly. I just have to go and see him and bumble through it. And then, of course, in time, you develop understanding and awareness of things.
What was Korea like back then, compared to now? It was pre-modern democratization of Korea. Korea was under authoritarian rule initially. How much has Korea changed? You've been here 4 decades now. Do you look back?
I do, and it's always fascinated me because one reason I've stayed so long is because of that fascination, is that the development of South Korea since Park Chung-hee, or maybe since the Korean War, has been so rapid, and it's the kind of development that, people now of my age, born in the 50s, would have seen it from intense poverty. They would have seen it all develop to one of the world's sort of powerhouses. Whereas in European countries, Britain, for example, you'd have to be about 250 years old to experience the same level. It's been so rapid. So that economic development continued. And what you found is when you went out of Seoul, you didn't suddenly lurch into extreme poverty. The development was relatively even.
Back then, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, people would dispute that and say, well, Cholado is disadvantaged. Yeah, but within reason, if you like. In other words, you didn't have extreme poverty in Cholado and then wealth somewhere else, such as you see in other, countries like the Philippines or Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and places. You get some very rich people and a real sort of entrenched elite with extremely poor people in the country. Well, the Koreans who were in charge, the people in charge of this country, were extremely poor people. So there'd been a kind of, in the 20th century, through the 20th century, there was a kind of revolution where the previous low classes, the soldiers, the merchants and people, became the generals and the chairmen of the big conglomerates, So the development was sort of relatively even. The politics was different. The country was, people were very free. This might seem like a contradiction.
Right.
They were very free, except when it came to anything to do with North Korea.
Okay.
And when it came to sort of challenging or over-challenging the dictatorship. So it's not that you would walk down the street and see soldiers clubbing people.
Right. Okay.
You would see groups of school children sort of screaming and shouting, and kids sort of playfully punching each other. There was this noise that you don't see in North Korea. North Korea is very, very quiet on the street.
Sure.
Because they're all extremely cautious.
So it's very free, but up to a certain point.
To a point.
Okay.
So
but from that point onwards, I'm guessing it was quite strict in Korea.
Yes, yeah. I don't want to mischaracterize it,
right.
But I compare it a lot. When I first went to North Korea, I was astonished. These are Korean people, but even on the street, walking down the street where there were sort of lots of people were very cautious, not talking to one another because they'd be overheard. So in the North Korean case, the dictatorship intrudes into your very thinking and your dreams. If you have a dream that something bad happens to the leader, you don't tell your family, I had a dream, you don't even, because you might get arrested even for that, Whereas the South Korean the South Korean society was very free until that point where you challenged the power, and particularly with North Korea, because that was the source of fear and anxiety and the justification for dictatorship.
So that has
you know.
changed quite a bit now, would you say?
Now that's
Of
changed.
course,
Yeah.
Korea's still very much free, but you can still, I guess, cross that line a lot more now.
Yeah. Well, no, you can't. It's a democracy now. So, you know, if in those days, if you got out on the street and held up a sign saying something,
Right. Okay.
there would be. I mean, I remember, to my shame, I suppose, sort of almost thinking sometimes I can understand why the police are annoyed by these demonstrators, because it seemed like, what right do these people have to get out in the street and yell and scream about something? They're just annoying everyone. But when you see the police now, they actually facilitate that, and you get a permit to protest and all that sort of stuff. So it's just that idea that people should be allowed to express themselves wasn't in the thinking. You know, there's a lot of change in people. There's a real change because, you know, young Koreans, when I first came here, they invariably grew up in the countryside. There was a huge pouring in, as you know, people pouring into the cities from the 70s. So they often started life in villages where they were one of 5, 6, 7, 8 siblings living close by with extended family. And this kind of familial, rural culture, if you like, comes into the cities. So it lasts for a while.
They have that energy, I'm guessing, the sort of energy to improve their lives and to transform.
Driven to improve. It's not like driven to get welfare from somebody. It's driven to improve their lives. And, you know, men were responsible for work to bring in the money, and they had to work so hard they hardly knew their kids. I mean, it was a 6-day work week. I remember going around to see some guy once on a Sunday and knocked on the door, and his wife said, "Oh, he's sleeping." And I realized what this guy did is he worked till like 10 o'clock at night for 6 days a week, and then he slept on a Sunday. You know, you had that sort of passion and energy about everything. And people walk, I noticed this, I come from London, and people walk in the street here twice as fast. You know, there was that kind of feeling about the place. So that's changed a bit now. Quite a lot, because a lot of people are only children.
They're born and raised in the city.
They're city people.
They've seen all the everything you can get, you know, by living in the city.
And you know, they're no longer the first in their family to be able to drive a car or something, you know, this sort of thing. So
I do think it's really interesting to talk to you because you're an observer, and I think you've been an observer rather than, I guess, of course you've been an active participant living in Korea, but I feel like you have a role as an outsider, as someone who's watching the country develop. I think it is important, of course, to talk to Korean people here about what they're seeing and feeling in the country, but I think there is value in taking a step back and seeing things from an outsider sort of a perspective as well, like you have. And you've seen so much over the years. You were here during the Chun Doo-hwan's authoritarian rule, as we said. You saw democratic elections in 87, the 88 Olympics, you said, and then, of course, everything after that, Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy, the Asian financial crash, 2002 World Cup, Roh Moo-hyun's death, the 2008 financial crash, Seoul ferry, the 2017 candlelight protests and Park Geun-hye's impeachment, Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump and the summits with North Korea, COVID-19, and now President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment.
That's the modern history.
Exactly, looking through all that and having been part of that and having seen all that, what events or stories have stuck with you the most?
I'd say, first of all, it was 1987. And I felt like I had a front row seat in that one. 1987 is when the protests happened. They went on for 3 weeks, all over the country. That eventually the ruling party candidate, No Tae-yu, gave a speech and said, okay, let's do it democratically. And actually the front row seat I had that was interesting is, just as a little digression, at the time I was the president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club.
Right.
And our members, we had noticed the photographers and the cameramen were reporting in that they were sort of getting a bit abused by students, because a lot of the news that we all covered was student protests. And there's a few cases of where Japanese, Asian looking, if you like, so Japanese and Korean photographers actually got assaulted or by protesters. Now, normally the students would see the foreign press as sort of on their side, so to speak.
Right.
So we kind of looked into this, and what we found was that the government had issued foreign press armbands to police photographers. So the police were coming in close, videotaping the protesters.
Right, okay.
Posing as foreign press.
Right.
So I took a delegation, as 4 of us went to meet a government official who took care of the foreign press to complain about this. And he wasn't very cooperative. So, in fact, that's an understatement. We had a yelling match, basically. And
just unimaginable nowadays.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. No, we were shouting at each other. He said that we're insulting the Korean people. We have a right to, So we decided on the spot to issue our own armbands, and we numbered them.
Right.
And we distributed them to the foreign. There's about 150 members at the time. And the very first event where we wore these defiantly and proudly was on June the 10th, 1987, at Jamshil Stadium, when the ruling party was formally anointing No Tae-yu as its candidate. Now, this anointment of No Tae-yu, this was when people saw who the next dictator was going to be. That was the feeling about it. Suddenly it was clear now, okay, it is No Tae-yu. We suspected, but yeah, it is No Tae-yu. That's what led to the protests. So an organization of social and religious leaders called for protests on June the 10th. And the signal for the protest was at 6 o'clock in the evening, car horns in Seoul, they would peep the horns. So we were up in the Foreign Press Club that night. There's a bar there. We were there. And having come back from this event with our armbands, and it seemed like the feeling was, well, it's a done deal then. This is it then. So the actual election will be at the end of the year, and No Tae will be the next president. And somebody opened the windows. It's on the 18th floor of the press center. It's still there, same place. Somebody opened one of the windows, and you heard this sort of noise in the background. So what's that? Because it was a noisy city,
Right. And it was the car horns.
It was the horns. And then a whole parade of them came down the main thoroughfare. And then everybody went out then, because a photographer came in, reeking of tear gas, said there's a big demo up there. So we all went out, and and that was the beginning.
So you felt real change at that point. You felt that was something.
That was what, at that moment, it was like yet another demo. Except the demos tended to be confined to campuses or their environ, but this was actually downtown. What made significant was that these people were not your normal students. And the Washington Post identified it first, said this is a middle-class revolution. And it was. It was ajumas, bankers, ordinary people made the effort to come out. And when the dictatorship realized that, it was all over. So they agreed to that tweak in the constitution. Then, of course, the irony was that No Tae-woo won the election. So that...
but it was democratic.
It was democratic, yeah.
Sure.
Can't be denied.
So even after everything you've seen since then, it's still that moment in 87 that sticks with you the most? The historic nature of that?
Yeah, that's the one that sticks with me the most. But, you know, this place is always exciting, so lots of things
have happened. So this is the reason I kind of wanted to go through all that as well, is because I wanted to ask you, where does the Yoon Suk-yeol martial law crisis rank in all the things that you've seen in Korea over the past 4 years? Because it does feel very big right now because we're living through it at this moment. But when you look back at Korea's history, so much has happened. I mean, even the martial law wasn't real martial law.
Right.
We've seen far greater situations, far more darker times in Korea as well. And Yoon had authoritarian tendencies, some would say, but he wasn't an actual authoritarian leader like Korea has seen in the past. So how significant do you think the whole Yoon martial law crisis has been compared to the other political crises that you've seen?
Well, I think there are two sort of perspectives on this that, you know, we can have at the same time. One is the response, as you said, that because it's contemporary, it's happening now, it seems all the more shocking. And then there's the sort of the stepping back and giving it time. So one reason that, as you said, it's because it's happening now, it seems shocking. The other reason, though, is that we live in this social media age where in the past, people would, whatever they felt about it, they'd be telling their friends, over the dinner table with the family or yelling about it or whatever. But now, of course, we're all journalists. You know, we're all sort of typing our opinions. And this seems to lead to sort of polarization, or at least a very emotional expression of things. I mean, there are people who, if he were to get the death penalty, which he could, in theory, for insurrection, there are a lot of people who think it should be carried out, you know. And yet, at the same time, I get people coming up to me and saying that he did exactly the right thing. He had no choice, you know. So, but to your question, where it stands is that it is a big deal and it isn't a big deal. Historically speaking, like if you ask North Korean defectors or the older generation, who either not too bothered about politics, or as long as they're not his political opponents, they've seen so much worse that this didn't really bother them that much. I mean, nothing happened. You know, he sent soldiers to 2 places. Nobody was killed. This is martial law. I mean, there wasn't a single roadblock in the entire country. There was no cutting of the internet or taking over of media or anything like that. And then the assembly voted against it, and he withdrew it in 6 hours. You know, but so I think in real terms it wasn't a big deal, but the meaning of it is very important. Why it was wrong, because there's this concept of how we say that, you know, in World War I, why it was so horrible is because the generals in charge were fighting the last war. You know, there's this tendency in this military concept of beware you don't fight the last war. In other words, you don't fight this war in the way you fought the last one, because the technology has changed and circumstances are different. And the transition to democracy by the Koreans involved the reining in of authoritarian power. And yet, ever since then, they've been going on about the imperial presidency. As if, to me, this is almost like they're fighting the last war. You know, our issues today are different. It's not that the president has too much power. He's not a king. But Yoon actually did overstep his mark, and it's the first time any of the democratically elected presidents overreached in that way. He used the constitutional power he has to introduce martial law, taking the entire country totally by surprise in order to probably express his frustration with the opposition party. You know, this is, it's so shocking, and he was rightfully impeached for it, you know. And now he's facing a criminal charge. To me, insurrection is a bit of a stretch too far, because, you know, he wasn't exactly... how you define this, I'm not quite sure. I'd say it was presidential overreach, but insurrection implies he was planning to install himself as the king of Korea or something. You know? So I think it seems very dramatic right now. We don't yet know what's going to happen to him. Well, he's been fired, but we don't know whether he's going to be incarcerated or what. But I think this will get forgotten. It'll sort of retreat into history and not be seen as such a dramatic event as we feel it is right now. That's my guess.
It'll feel like a bit of a blip in Korea's history.
That's a good way of describing it. A bit of a, what on earth was that? You know, that was a very peculiar thing to do. Now, if in fact the troops were out in the street, roadblocks, internet was cut, and people were killed, then that's very serious.
Right.
But this is not what happened. You know.
So you saying this feels like a bit of a blip if we perhaps imagine looking back on this in the future. Where do you think this has left the nation? Some are worried that this has left the nation more polarized and politically divided than ever before. Or was Korea always polarized? Or is it always polarized in politics, even out around the world, essentially? Because everywhere at the moment does feel polarized, but is there anything particularly different about Korea?
It does fit well. I would say there's definite polarization in Western countries. You know, the once upon a time a Democrat could marry a Republican, but I'm not sure if that happens anymore. But and I think there's a social media angle to this. But I think Korea's slightly different in it's not really that polarized. It seems like that because, you know, in this country, our kind of Confucian heritage calls for kind of unity and calm and peace. And there's this sort of feeling, I bet you whoever wins this election, in their speech, they're going to talk about the nation should come together again. Well, okay, were we really that divided? We were just sort of, it's like yelling for two football teams. You know, the common game of football is what's shared, but you can passionately loathe the other side. And it's all contained. And I say that, I'm not being flippant when I say that. It's because, unlike in the West, there's very little fundamental ideological distinction between the two main sides. We don't have a Nazi party here, and we don't have a communist party here. And we've basically got, we call it left and right, but even there, if you look at their economic policies and their social policies, you'd be hard-pressed to guess which one was the left and which was the right. They're that similar. I mean, I have a bit of a theory about what distinguishes them, and it's more to do with North Korea.
Right.
But
so there is all this concern about Korea being more divided than ever, more polarized than ever. But you're saying,
so.
in your perspective, you don't see that as a concern yet.
I don't see it as a concern that I mean, in fact, ironically, well, that's because I'm not too bothered who wins this election. Really, the people who support the incumbent government feel that if the Democratic Party wins, the country's going to go to hell.
Right.
And I'm sure the feeling's mutual. It's like, frankly, I don't think that there'll be a tweak to one way or but I don't think it's that serious. Ironically, what gives me optimism is just to explain my theory about what really separates them. Is I think there are two concepts of the Korean nation people have, and you can have both in your mind at the same time.
Okay.
One of which is that my country is the Republic of Korea. It was formed in 1948. We survived a war. We leaned a lot on the Americans. We're a bit embarrassed by how much we did that, but and we had dictators who weren't the nicest people, but we were a bit embarrassed about that. But we became a democracy and economic powerhouse, and now we're admired around the world. And North Korea, when it's ready, can join this. So the ROK will double in land space and get another 25 million people. That's one view of Korea. That's the country I'm loyal to, so to speak. The other view is that both Koreas are imperfect. And I call this the difference in right and left. So the leftist intellectuals tend to be embarrassed or negative about Korea's history. They've tried to write... if you ask people, what do you think of Syngman Rhee, the first president, you're going to get something negative.
Right.
What do you think of Park Chung-hee? Well, begrudging, but a negative instinct,
Sure.
And, but they don't like North Korea either. North Korea is 10 times worse. But they feel the need to be nice to North Korea because through the unity of the two, a new nation will be born.
Right, okay.
So the first view is the right wing, the other view is the left wing. But the thing is North Korea has now come out and said it's not interested in unification.
Right.
So that shuts down the so-called left, in my theory, the left wing view. I mean, if the left wing come into power and then try to start talks and Kim Jong-un says, I'm not really interested, we don't want unification anymore with you people. And he keeps that up for 20 years. You've got a whole generation of North Koreans grow up not caring about this. That shuts down that left-wing view of the nation. So then we fall into the ROK version. So I think we're actually, possibly that might be the direction we go in which case we are. What is going to divide us now? We'll find something else because we need to argue about something. But right now, ideologically and so on, I think we're headed for, this may seem very counterintuitive because of what's going on.
So by taking away the North Korea issue, if North Korea are serious about not wanting unification, and they don't negotiate with a liberal government at all. So you're saying if you take that away, then that was before in the past such a divisive issue. But if you take that away now, there's less things for there to be philosophically divided about. So therefore, they're going to be talking more about the issues, you're saying.
I think so, yeah. And then we'll argue about, as you do in politics, rightly so, we've got this issue, so we think this is the way to go. Oh no, we think this is the way to go. But that fundamental question of what is my country may get resolved. I mean, with unification, it would get resolved anyway.
Sure.
But so I don't see.
You're not concerned about Lee Jae-myung becoming president,
No.
then, like the Conservatives are.
I don't think so. I think his predecessor Moon Jae-in was actually more ideological, and than Lee Jae-myung. I think Lee Jae-myung is going to be focusing on economy. You know, I mean, just a small.
What do you make of the concerns that the Conservatives have over Lee Jae-myung, that he's going to sell the nation over to the Chinese, that they're talking about they're going to emigrate to other countries because they fear what Lee Jae-myung is going to do to the country. The fact that he's not a trustworthy figure, that they're essentially saying. What do you make of the concerns that they have? Because it is very extreme, it seems. That
It does seem
the Conservatives at the moment are trying to put together a unified candidate, which the platform is essentially anyone but E.
Yeah, and I think well, if that's their platform, I think they're going to make the same mistakes the Democrats made in America. Their platform was all about the character of Donald Trump. That was their single issue. Donald Trump campaigned on immigration and inflation, economics, which is what actually bothered people, because everyone was sort of tired of all this. Yeah, okay, we know Trump's a weirdo. We don't care. If they focus too much on Lee Jae-myung being this sort of villainous character who's going to sell the nation, I think they're going to lose, because a lot of people don't pay attention to that sort of thing, and it has the sort of quality of sort of singing to the choir. In other words, you're yelling, and the only people sort of really paying attention is your own audience. So I think it's not a good way to do what they should be doing. They've got to realize what a difficult position they're in. They are representing the party whose leader just tried to introduce martial law as a tactic to backfoot the opposition. This is complete violation of the purpose that there's a martial law clause in the Constitution, as a presidential right. It's not for that. And so they have to acknowledge that, which they could, because they actually they voted it down. And then some of them voted with him to impeach. So they could take this position. And they could focus on the issues people care about, because there is concern about the opposition. There's a lot of concern about the way they went haywire in the National Assembly in the last year, impeaching this unprecedented level of impeaching of public officials who wouldn't do their will. Why? Because they had the votes in the Assembly for the first time that allowed them to do that. And they just showed that they behaved really frivolously, in my opinion, with that. So, you can point that out, but the real thing is economics and the future of the country, the American alliance. Who's the person we want negotiating with Donald Trump? For example, is it the Harvard-educated economics expert, ex-prime minister, acceptable to both sides, or is it Lee Jae-myung, doesn't speak English, seen as a bit of a crook, is going to... Trump will get this news. Oh yeah, in Korea they think he's going to sell the country to China. Is he? There's all sorts of themes you could push, but if it's simply Lee Jae-myung's character, I think they're going to be in trouble.
But even as Lee Jae-myung as a president, what kind of leader do you think he will be?
Well, it's hard to predict what people are going to be like, but what I have found observing Korea all these years is that the establishment side, by establishment I sort of mean the right side, and this was in the dictatorship era but then continued, invariably portrays the candidate from the left in these sort of terms, you know. I mean, literally, there were people who thought Kim Dae-jung, who became the president at the turn of the century, was a communist. So he's going to sell the country down, you know. And this was pure nonsense. But people strongly believe that. And so I think Lee Jae-myung, I think he will be more pragmatic. You know, I think you have to distinguish between the way a candidate yells and screams and says things as part of the boxing match of political competition.
Right.
Then once they win, how they're going to behave once they're there.
Right.
Now, obviously, these things are connected, but I don't think it's going to be I think it's going to be more pragmatic than ideological. To give an example of the pragmatism, by the way, or the change, when the previous 2 presidents ago, Moon, came in, his presidency was highly influenced policy-wise by NGOs. In fact, they used to joke it's the NGO presidency. And so he was for that reason, very opposed to the nuclear industry in the wake of the Japanese nuclear disaster. And so they started shutting down, you know, there was a long-term plan to phase out nuclear.
Right.
When Yoon came in, he turned this around. So we bring back nuclear. And initially less enthusiastic about alternative energy, but now that's sort of picking up. So everyone's expected Lee Jae-myung to turn that back again, but actually he's not. Just this week, he's just said he's not going to do that. So he's also going to have nuclear in the energy mix, you know. So this type of pragmatic thing is because none of these things are deeply ideologically driven, you know. It's all pragmatism.
How important do you think presidents are going to be going forward for Korea? Because Korea is facing so many issues at the moment. When it comes to things like the low birth rate, that's going to affect everything. The economy, pensions, jobs, everything. How important is politics to address all of these concerns?
Well,
because, you know, because the question is, how much can a president and politicians and policymakers really affect
Actually, I'm glad you asked
huge
that.
challenges?
I'm really glad you asked that question because...
And also, I guess, are you hopeful that Korea can address these issues?
Yeah, I am. But as I say, I'm really glad you asked that question because we live in a very political era where, and I think this is, forget Korea for a moment, like in the West, people are much more passionate about politics than I remember they used to be, and they put much more expectation on political leaders than I remember they used to. And I think some of this has to do with the weakening of Christianity or religion generally, in that for many people, politics has assumed the importance of a faith. And this is why you get this feeling sometimes. I mean, Donald Trump, in a way, earns the dislike people have of him, and the support he has. He's an unusual character, but still, you get this feeling that some people literally think Satan has won the election. You know, in America, one Korean student in American university was telling me that there were kids in his class who were crying. And so the professor let them go home. And then they were sort of offered if you need any sort of counseling. And he's sitting there thinking, okay, you lost the election, so what? You know. But there's this idea, and when Obama came in, it was almost like the second coming. You know, we throw the Nobel Peace Prize at him. And but I observed this because I've always seen that in Korea. Politics has always been important. And this goes back to the Confucian origins, where political power and sort of spirituality, if you like, are the same thing, or the fundamental purpose of life is derived from those sort of power relations, if you like, the king and the subject, the father and the son, and like that. And so politics has always had this sort of passion to it and meaning put onto it. But the reality is that there's only so much government can do. I think the government has made a fool of itself when it's tried to address the low birth rate. I mean, the classic example of that, a few years ago, what ministry was it? The gender ministry, was it? Where the minister instructed them to, in the ministry, turn off all the lights at 6 o'clock, and all the bureaucrats had to go home. Why? Well, they're supposed to be making babies. You know, and it's like a sort of, obviously it's a gesture, it's not a solution, but it's a gesture. But it seems ridiculous, because if I was the president, I would say, okay, we can chuck a bit of welfare here and there if these are the real issues, but this is a problem that is connected with what we think the meaning of life is. I'll tell you what Korea is struggling with this is, when I came here, the older generation, if their purpose in life, as far as they were concerned, was to continue their lineage, this is why there was such an emphasis on having a son, because the daughter goes to the other family when she marries, but the son continues the lineage. So there was a kind of historical imperative to continue the lineage, and people felt this was what life was about, you know. And later with Park Chung-hee in that time, and I remember hearing a speech when my daughter, it wasn't that long ago now, but about 15 years ago, my daughter started at a kindergarten. The kindergarten headmistress gave a speech, basically to the effect that you will all grow up to contribute to the national economy. And under Park Chung-hee, it's like the meaning of life that projected onto people was precisely that. It's you contributing to the nation. Right. You know, me sort of cobbling the shoes together, I'm actually doing something. You know, there's great meaning in that. But right now, there is no obvious meaning. There's something collectively in the country where it's not clear why we're here. And so I think that's not a president's job to solve. But I think Korea will find that. I think, you know, societies go in sort of cycles. So I think Korea will discover that again and give meaning to its young people, and why they should go through. The reason that this meaning is important is because you look around at other people, marriage and children seem like so difficult. Why do I want to go through that? You know, you're not going to put your hand up and say, oh, could I experience childbirth, please? You know, so you need to have a deeper drive that makes you instinctively want to do that. You know, and I think it's a very human thing, but I think somehow we've lost touch with it, and we need to find.
We need to find it, but you're still hopeful that Korea will.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I don't know how, but I don't think it'd be political. I don't think it's like, oh, we're going to unify and that gives us purpose. I think unification is going to be, in that sense, less inspiring than people. You know, the first day will be inspiring, but no, I think it's more philosophical than that. You know.
Well, I would love to be able to pick your brain further, but I think we've taken up plenty of your time today. You've been very generous with it already. So we'll wrap it up here for today. But it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you again for your time.
Okay, pleasure.
So that was Michael Breen. Some fun stories there from his past and some interesting observations as well. I'd be quite curious to hear what you all think of some of his analysis, actually, as I think he raised quite a few points that would spark a lively debate. So please leave a comment if you have any thoughts. And as ever, or I should say as always, if you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback, you can also email koreanpoliticsdebrief@gmail.com. In the meantime, that's where I'll wrap it up this week. Thank you for listening, and till next time, bye for now.